If we had a functioning news media, which we don't, there's a video that would be leading every newscast right now. It has nothing to do with a plane crash in Russia, a GOP primary debate, or even the indictment of every lawyer who's ever given Donald Trump legal advice, as important as all those topics may be. But this video is about Americans, including children, who died horribly this month. It's about how their deaths could have been prevented if their government was even remotely competent. The footage I'm talking about is an interview with a survivor of the fires in Maui. This interview was conducted not by CNN or NPR, but by a real estate agent who moonlights as a citizen journalist. And he spoke with a man who goes by the name Fish, who survived the blaze in Lahaina. And here's what that man saw. Listen.
And I went out and I saw the fire, and you couldn't even see the gateway because it was covered with smoke. And everyone's standing around just looking. And I said, I think we should get out of here because of the speed of this wind. It could be here in 2 minutes. So I went around back to Front Street, and all the cars were lined up, but none of them were moving. And I walked all the way from Safeway to the chart house. Not one car had moved. And I was wondering what was stopping the traffic. Well, it was a policeman. And I got to the end, and I looked up north. There were no obstructions. There was no reason to keep those cars there.
Are you serious?
I'm serious as a heart attack. And I said, what are you doing? He goes, well, I'm under orders to keep them here. And I said, the fire is right around Safeway. It's going to hit Front Street. You know, these people got to get out of here. And he said, I'm following orders.
No way.
And so I just kept walking. Well, maybe he knows something I don't, you know. So, and I keep walking down the highway, and I look behind, no cars are coming out. I walked all the way to Waikuli Beach, still no cars coming out. And I started hearing boom, boom, boom. And then I heard people screaming and stuff.
You're saying they were blockaded in by the police at the end of Front Street?
Yeah.
Like where that restaurant is?
Where the chart house
Where the chart house was, I should
Right.
say. There was a blockade there, and they could not go any further.
Right. From Safeway to there, not one car had moved.
I mean, it's amazing. And we get that video from, well, it goes HawaiiRealEstate.org. Gives us that video with that information. He says all the cars were lined up, but none of them were moving, and I was wondering what was stopping the traffic. It was a policeman. A policeman sitting there trapping all of these people in the what is soon to be an inferno. And as incredible as that account may seem, it's clear now that it's accurate. There are multiple witnesses saying the same thing. The Associated Press reports that as residents of one West Maui neighborhood tried to flee using the only paved road in town, quote, car after car was turned back toward the rapidly spreading wildfire by a barricade blocking access to Highway 30. Turned back towards the fire. Supposedly authorities were worried about downed power lines, and there certainly were, we can assume, plenty of downed power lines. But the problem is that the other option, rather than navigating around that hazard, was to stay and die in the blaze. Seems obvious which was the better choice, and yet police tried to force the residents to stay put. Many who listened and turned back, ended up burning to death in their cars, being literally cooked to death in their cars. The most horrific death imaginable. Others were forced to jump over the seawall and tread water while inhaling smoke. The people who obeyed the authorities ended up dead in many cases. It's as simple as that. On the other hand, people who ignored the authorities fared a lot better. Around 3 p.m., for example, a man named Nate Baird and his family tried to drive south out of town, but found that the road was blocked by cones and crews who were, quote, working on downed electric poles, according to the AP. And that's when Baird decided to ignore what the work crews told him. He drove around the cones, and his family traveled for about an hour until they reached safety. The article lists several other examples of people who are alive today because they ignored barricades, they ignored the instructions from authorities, and they did what they knew was the smartest thing. One 38-year-old woman, Kim Cuevas Reyes, ignored authorities' instructions to turn towards the local civic center, which became an ad hoc shelter for refugees. And instead of doing that, the AP reported, quote, she takes a left, driving in the wrong lane to pass a stack of cars heading in the other direction. That decision saved her life. Quote, the gridlock would have left us there when the firestorm started, the woman said. Quote, I would have had to tell my children to jump into the ocean as well and be boiled alive by the flames. Or we would have just died from smoke inhalation and roasted in the car. It wasn't until several hours later that authorities announced that the road out of Lahaina was open for traffic. Several hours later. By that point, indeed, many people on that road called Front Street had burned to death in their cars or died of smoke inhalation. Now, how is it possible that authorities blocked off one of the only usable routes that would have brought them to safety during a wildfire? Given that officials in Hawaii were aware of the risk of wildfire for a long time, that is an excellent question. Now, last summer in regulatory filings, Hawaii Electric made it clear that the risk of deadly wildfires was real, especially during high winds. And yet, apparently, the plan for dealing with this kind of disaster didn't preclude sealing all the roads and trapping people in the middle of a wildfire. Now, if you think back to Hurricane Katrina, as we made this comparison a few days ago, one of the biggest failures of FEMA back then was a lack of planning. The government ran evacuation simulations but didn't implement the necessary improvements after those simulations. So when the hurricane struck, there was chaos. A lot of people died as a result. And we're seeing that exact same thing yet again. All these years later, the same lack of preparation for hazards and catastrophes that are foreseeable. That's what's causing people to die. The difference is that we aren't hearing much about FEMA in the aftermath of the catastrophe in Maui. And why is that? It's a good question. Deanne Criswell is the administrator of FEMA. She's that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. She had the same job that Michael Brown did in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina made landfall in New Orleans. And Brown, you might remember, became a household name in the wake of that disaster, and not in a good way. When George Bush told Brown that he was doing a heck of a job, it instantly became a national scandal. Brown was so radioactive that no one was allowed to say anything nice about him. Unlike Michael Brown, though, Deanne Criswell is not well known. You've probably never even heard her name. I didn't know it until I looked it up. Despite the ongoing disaster in Maui, the national news media and the major political parties in Washington still hold her somehow in high regard. Just the other day, she sat for a friendly interview on Face the Nation. This is after the disaster and the bungled handling of that disaster. But listen to how this interview went. Watch.
FEMA Director Deanne Criswell toured the damage yesterday with local officials. Our Jonathan Vigliotti spoke with her after.
You were on the ground touring the disaster zone. What did you see and what struck you the most?
It's absolutely heartbreaking to just see an entire community that is no longer there. And I think one of the things that was just really the most shocking, I guess I would say, is the row of cars of people that were trying to drive and escape and then couldn't get out fast enough. And these are the ones that ended up running or jumping into the water, and those cars just there. I mean, it was like a scene from an apocalyptic movie.
So the burned out cars were the most shocking thing, says the FEMA director. It was like an apocalyptic movie. There's no scrutiny from Face the Nation or any media outlet about why those cars were stranded there in the first place. There wasn't any question in that segment about why FEMA didn't have evacuation plans that might have ensured the survival of all those people. We learned yesterday that Hawaii's top emergency response officials were on another island, supposedly learning how to respond to wildfires on the day the blaze began in Maui. And some key federal disaster officials were apparently busy at some FEMA meetings. Well, what explains that? Again, we have no idea because no one is asking. Reporters are busy talking to Deanne Criswell, the FEMA director, like she's some bystander visiting Maui for the first time. This is the opposite of how the press treated Michael Brown decades ago. It's not hard to see why this might be the case. Deanne Criswell, unlike Michael Brown, is working for Democrats. She's also the first woman to run FEMA. So she has the whole identity politics thing going. It would look very bad if the first woman to run FEMA is also responsible for bungling the response to one of the worst disasters in American history. Of course, no matter how it looks, that's exactly what happened. But the media has decided to plug its ears and close its eyes and pretend it's not happening. But if you do what no major media outlet is interested in doing, if you look into Criswell's past, there's a lot to discuss. As investigative journalist Nick Sortor pointed out the other day, Criswell's government biography states that, quote, one of her most significant accomplishments was leading the coordination of New York City's response to the COVID-19 pandemic when she served as the commissioner of the New York City Emergency Management Department. Now, New York's handling of COVID, you might remember, led to more than 10,000 deaths in nursing homes. Deaths that were undercounted for several months until investigative reporters noticed discrepancies in the government's data. These are also deaths that were totally avoidable. But they made the decision in New York City to take people that they knew were infected with COVID and put them in nursing homes right in the middle of these places where you have the most vulnerable populations. And 10,000 people at least died as a result. Now, in most countries, everyone overseeing a response like that would never work again in any capacity, much less in disaster relief. They'd go to prison for life, if anything. But Deanne Criswell was never even criticized. In fact, she got a promotion. 10,000 deaths in nursing homes, and she got promoted. And then, overseeing yet another failed disaster response, she gets softball questions from every news outlet, which is astonishing, really. We've seen our public health authorities and political leaders lead us into one disaster after another, and they're not slowing down. Right now, because it's an election year and Pfizer stock is in trouble, the media is, as it happens, is gearing up for COVID 2.0. Several major corporations and some universities are already implementing mask mandates again. They're gearing up to do the whole thing over again. Watch.
You're sick of hearing about COVID. So are we. The problem is what is coming because of this new wave of COVID that is really statistically meaningless. What's coming is really important because, as George predicted, some people just can't let go of the emergency. More importantly, the emergency powers. Lionsgate Entertainment out in Hollywood is back to masks and testing. We talked about colleges yesterday. There are now 104 colleges in the U.S. still mandating COVID vaccines for students. Of course, faculty are exempted. Some have indicated they will never let this go. All the while, they refuse to make sense of their pseudoscience on the list. Rutgers, Harvard, and more. We can now add that Morris Brown College in Atlanta and the Seattle government, who are never wrong, the government doctors didn't get a thing wrong during COVID. They want mandatory face masks for healthcare workers.
Now, along these lines, CNN just published an article entitled, "It May Be Time to Break Out the Masks Against COVID, Some Experts Say." They're the experts again. The report scolds Americans for not being sufficiently deferential to people with advanced degrees and positions of power. Quote, despite the concern among experts in some institutions, Americans don't appear to be worried enough, they say, about the recent rise in cases to change their behavior. COVID-19 was at the bottom of the list of key public health threats, according to the latest Axios poll. Now, it's not hard to see why Americans are reacting that way. The first time around, more than 3 years ago, the conventional wisdom was that if you wanted to survive, your best bet was to trust the experts. And the experts embarrassed themselves and were revealed to be lying one after another. You know, they said that you could protest for BLM and be safe, but you couldn't protest against lockdowns. Nobody really trusts these experts anymore for good reason. That's encouraging, but the truth is it's not enough. A lot of people just died in Maui because officials forcibly blockaded them. The government and the experts prevented these American citizens from leaving their neighborhood as a wildfire approached them. They burned to death because they were trapped there by the authorities. The only way to survive was not simply to doubt, not simply to be skeptical, but to actively disobey what you were being told by the authorities. Now, when the next lockdown comes, whether the pretext is a climate emergency or something else, that's going to be the correct response. Do what Nate Baird did in Maui. Ignore the liars calling themselves experts. Do what you think is best for yourself and your family, and do it fast. Otherwise, quicker than you might think, you'll be trapped. And by that point, like the people of Maui, there will be no way out. Because the fact is that increasingly, we live in a country where only those who disobey will survive.